Well, good evening, everyone. Good to see everybody. How's everybody doing? Good? Couple thumbs up, couple head nods. Staff, good? Amanda, good? Everybody's good. Nina's good. Nina's live. You're with us, Nina? All right. Well, good evening, everyone. I'd like to call the July 25th Planning Policy Commission meeting to order. It's currently 6:32 p.m. Today's meeting is a hybrid meeting. The Planning Policy Commission is in person, but staff, and we do have some staff, that'll be joining us virtually as well in attendance. And we also have a commissioner here tonight that will also be joining us virtually. Tonight, we're looking for quorum. So staff, do we have quorum this evening?
Chair Voice, you do have a quorum tonight. All the commissioners not in attendance are excused.
Okay. And I think this is probably an appropriate time to let the commission, our staff, and our city know that unfortunately, Ama Simweta has been called to a different part of the country. So he unfortunately resigned. So he will not be joining us anymore. But Ama, if you are listening, I would like to say that we deeply appreciated what you have to your service here to the Planning Policy Commission, and we wish you good luck wherever your ventures may take you. We're going to begin right now with our first item of business, which is to take action to approve the minutes for the June 20th, 2024 meeting, as well as the June 27th, 2024 meeting. We'll start with June 20th. Are there any corrections or concerns for those meeting minutes that were provided in your agenda packet? All right, hearing none, those minutes are approved. Same for June 27th. Are there any issues, concerns, wobbles, quibbles? Nothing. Okay, those meeting minutes are also approved. Now, this is a fun part of our meeting. We get to hear from our public. So, we'll hold public comment at this time. Do we have anyone that signed up to speak at this time?
No, we do not.
Oh. All right. Let's move on to regular business. And tonight, this evening, we have two items under regular business, and the first is neighborhood planning.
Chair Voice, we do have one virtual hand for audience comment.
Oh, perfect. Okay. All right. Well, we appreciate that, and we do ask that you speak clearly and pause frequently. We ask that you state your name, and if you are attending, we do ask that you mute your microphone when you're not speaking, and if you're having any technical issues, please try joining the meeting using a different device, such as a smartphone or tablet. We want to collect all of your response. You can use the call-in information in the meeting invite to call into the meeting. This part of our process is clearly important to us. They help us with making decisions, but we do ask that you keep your comments to 5 minutes or less. So please, when they are ready.
I'm ready, because that was a go. Okay, I'm Connie Marsh. I live on Squawk. And I suppose the first one was, I just wanted to make sure you all knew that your recommendation on the pre-application neighborhood meetings was overturned by council. I was at least able to get it down for council to discuss because the subcommittee had changed it and then put it on the consent agenda, which I thought was not right. And so at least they discussed it. So moving on to tonight's agenda, the neighborhood meetings, well, the memo does not address my concerns. The actual little plan, the draft plan for public engagement does. I'm a little curious as to why there's a discrepancy between the memo and that, but there you go. So now on to the comprehensive plan 1. It is too voluminous for a mere human who is busy to make comments on this as formed. So I don't know how you intend to break it down if you actually expect the public to come out and comment on it. So from what I have read, this is what I see. There is an attaboy for changes to the environmental chapter. However, you still don't have the wildlife right. Wildlife goes through our yards, our streets, it's everywhere. And for some reason, the city keeps relegating it to riparian corridors, like that's how we actually interact with wildlife. It's just not true. And then the rest is there is too much variety in the voices per chapter. It is so clear that different people have written different things that it is discordant. And then beyond being discordant, it's too wordy. And so all the language could be reduced by at least half. And then it is so technical that it doesn't feel like Issaquah. In pretty much any of the language, there's a few sentences that actually feel like a community. The rest of the sentences feel like government jargon and gives no particular sense of what we want Issaquah to be as a bunch of humans trying to live together and be super happy and enjoy our town. And I think really, in essence, this is what a comprehensive plan is for. It is to direct policy to create a town that the community members really want to live in. And that sense is not available in this comprehensive plan. It has been in past comprehensive plans. The introductory chapter is a great example of this. There's no passion for Issaquah at all. And so I have no idea where the city is trying to make us go. All it talks about is, you know, the rules and regulations and what the outside agency says that we should be. And that is not what the introductory chapter is for. So, because this is way too much to try to wordsmith and create actual effective change in this form, I'm going to leave it at that high of a level and ask you to try to figure out how to make staff break it down into something more palatable so the community can actually input. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other speakers? Thank you, Connie. And thank you for the word of the day, discordant. Try to use it in a sentence. All right, now off to regular business. So tonight we have two items, and the first is neighborhood planning. And Valerie Porter, our associate planner, will be presenting tonight. So Valerie, virtually Valerie, when you're ready, please go ahead.
All right. Chair Voice, can you see my screen?
I can.
Thank you. All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Valerie, and I'm going to be talking about the Neighborhood Planning Guide. So the Neighborhood Planning Guide is a document that will be used internally by staff, and it's going to be an attachment to the comprehensive plan. So tonight, we're not looking for a recommendation to council or anything like that. We're just looking for some feedback. And to help guide the discussion, two questions are being posed. The first one is, does the commission have any recommendations on the level of public engagement needed to develop a neighborhood plan? And then the second question is, are there any additional changes that you would like to see with this plan? So objectives. So while updating the citywide strategic plan, this idea of having a guide to develop plans specific to each neighborhood was created. The objective of this guide is to help staff work with the community members to develop a visioning plan for a 10 to 15 year time period for their specific neighborhood that aligns with the comprehensive plan. This guide is intended to be a tool for staff and also work in coordination with capital improvement projects as well as steer land use decisions. At this time, we're not quite sure how many plans we're going to have in the future, but when we do have more than one, we like to make sure that the plans are consistent. So the plan format. So the document starts off with an introduction detailing what is a neighborhood plan. It then goes into public engagement, where we're talking about who the key audience members are. Those are business members, owners, students, anyone involved with the community or the neighborhood. And then we then go into roles and responsibilities. We talk about the individual roles that are necessary for the community as well as for the staff. The document then goes into listing specific tasks that we believe are necessary to develop a neighborhood plan. And then at the end of the document, there is a basic outline that we're hoping that all of these neighborhood plans would follow. Here, I've tried to just kind of pull out some key tasks from the list of tasks that are in the document. First, we would start off with just preparing a preliminary scope of work, which is identifying, what the neighborhood is, the timeline, who needs to be involved. Then staff would have an internal kickoff meeting with other members of the staff just to coordinate and understand if there's any capital improvement projects happening in the neighborhood and hoping to guide any background information. Once we have a background plan, we would then hold a neighborhood visioning meeting. And this is the first touch with the community where we'd be looking for information, what the community thought thinks is important, what do they cherish about their neighborhood. And then once staff gets all this information, we would then take that and draft the neighborhood plan. From there, we would then present that draft to the neighborhood, gain additional feedback, and then take that information and then finalize the draft plan. Once we have a good draft or final draft, we would then start the process of presenting this to all the boards and commission to then ultimately have the document adopted. So again, I pose these two questions, and at this time, I would like to ask if there's any questions or comments.
Thank you, Valerie. Excellent presentation.
Thank you.
And yes, we do have some comments. So again, this is really more of a discussion. We're giving Valerie and staff some feedback. Clearly, this is probably, we'll see this again. So Commissioner Kraft.
Hello, thanks for that. I love a very short PowerPoint. It's my heart. So my comments are going to be more showing that I came from a big company, can you go back to the one that has all the different color flow charts? I think it was called Process. Thank you. I think it'd be super helpful as you roll it out. And I'm going to use a term, it's called ORPI. On each one of these blocks, so it's very clear of what staff does, and maybe specifically on staff versus community or boards. And I'll explain what that means. So ORPI is owner, like who's the owner of that element. Approver, sometimes it's the same, sometimes it's different. Reviewer, and some of these have multiple people who review it. Participant, sometimes people give feedback. They're not, and once again, this is from a Microsoft standpoint, so it may not be exactly applicable. And then inform, that's just more people who have the readout. And I think that will add clarity. I like the fact that there's involvement across a lot of different steps, but maybe going through, and I'm happy to help you think through this if you need, of the role of each group so they could see where they plug in and how it kind of flows through, so it doesn't seem like, oh, we get this, I was overwhelmed too when you get a 300-page document to review, but there may be different elements to go through. So that may just make it helpful and I'm not sure how many neighborhoods we're going to do, or this is going to be done for. I know you can't, I looked at my neighborhood, hopefully mine's one of them. And then once you get the first one, then the next ones are much easier once you kind of get through that. That's the only feedback that I had.
That's great. Thank you. And yes, I'll probably reach out just to understand that a little bit more and understand what that looks like.
Excellent. Thank you, Commissioner Kraft. We'll wait for some more feedback for Valerie. Commissioner Milligan.
Okay, here I come. Thank you, Chair Boyce, and thank you, Valerie. I have a little handful of questions. And should I just go through all of them, Chair Voice, or do you want me to go one at a time?
No, I'd go for all of them. As long
Put 'em out there?
as
Okay.
as many as Valerie
Put 'em
can
out
handle.
Yeah, all right. Okay.
Time,
So,
please.
looking on of the packet, page 22, who should participate in neighborhood planning? Anyone who lives, works, or spends time in the neighborhood. It's the spends time in the neighborhood that was not feeling clear enough for me. And later on in the document, it says something like lives, works, plays, and prays, which is a little more specific. I don't know if that's the right phrase. But what I was thinking about was how do we protect the members of a community from perhaps getting kind of hijacked during their process from somebody who's not a member. And then I got very academic about who is the city accountable to in a neighborhood, as an elected governance structure. I don't have the answer to this question. I know that we talk about stakeholders, and our business community is very important to us, for instance, but are we accountable to all property owners, even if they don't live in Issaquah? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question, but it made me think deeply about how to very specifically protect the people who are members of a neighborhood. And I'm only giving you the live, works, plays, prays as maybe a better. It lives, learns, works, plays, prays. That was better than just people who are sometimes in a neighborhood. You could say, or spends significant time in a neighborhood. That was one. I look forward to hearing from my fellow commissioners on what they thought, if that jumped out at them. Okay, wait, there's more. Okay, so then down later in task number 6, the neighborhood assessment survey. I have found when I've done neighborhood surveys in Issaquah Highlands, it's very difficult to I think Thomas can do this, but I just didn't know how, to make sure you're getting honest voices from inside your community, especially with an online survey or something like that. It's really easy for people who may have other opinions than those in the neighborhood to input their voice. So I wanted to make sure that we could manage neighborhood surveys so that they truly measure the voices of the community members. And then, you guys all take a note so you can jump in later with your ideas. Okay, task number 7, where it says, consider what makes a neighborhood more vibrant, livable, and different from other neighborhoods. My complaint is with the phrase more vibrant. Not all neighborhoods want to be vibrant. Vibrant means lively, noisy, active, bright. I think that could be removed unless other people think differently. And then the paragraph following that in task number 7, where it says help community members reach consensus on a vision for the neighborhood. I just wanted to offer a strategic thought in that hopefully our neighborhoods are very diverse and have all sorts of opinions and ways of doing things, and that's what's going to make it rich. That if there were a way to capture city staff should help community members find their common ground, something that specified that we're not trying to make you all march to the same drummer, but rather identify where you have commonalities that you can champion. And yeah, there was another phrase later where in task number 12, you distribute the neighborhood plan to interested parties. I thought that was a little vague and didn't specify the particular stakeholders we're trying to reach in a neighborhood. And I think that's it for now. Some of the other stuff was in the table of potential neighborhood plan outline. That was just a little too meaty. I don't think I'm ready to. I'd be happy to talk about that some other time. I'll listen and see if my other commissioners contribute about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Milligan. What'll help staff is if you can come up with a clever acronym. Staff loves acronyms. So if you could do that, the winner. Let me see if, let's get the other people in here first. Commissioner Kennedy, Commissioner Issaquah, Commissioner Patterson. You guys have any, I just want to make sure you guys get an opportunity to speak. I mean, we could come back to you. I have a comment. Okay, Commissioner Krass.
So Nina made a very good point. And it comes, this is kind of a bigger question, is like, who gets what say? And go back to the Orpy thing as an example. People may get informed, but maybe they don't get to review or participate. So for example, I'll put myself, so let's say I go to Bellevue every now and then, and I go to Maidenbower Park, the beach there. Should I have a say in their neighborhood plan because I play there? Probably not. So I do wonder whether you refine it even more. So you could say, go back to each one of these. People who live here, of course they have a say in their neighborhood. People who work in the neighborhood, yes, I think they have a say in that neighborhood. People who play in the neighborhood or pray, I kind of want to stay away from religious aspects of these things, but if you're here once a month, do you get a say in the neighborhood? I don't know. I think that's an element of discussion of who are stakeholders that you listen to versus just inform. And I think, I'm sure staff will have a point of view on that, but I just think it's a question that we should be clear on before you start rolling this out to people in the community. That's all. So thank you, Nina, for making it double click on that one a little bit more.
Thank you, Commissioner Krass. Commissioner Patterson.
Awesome, thank you. I suppose mine's probably kind of a clarifying question, which is maybe you can help me understand some of the potential outcomes of a neighborhood plan. So, for instance, some things that came out of my mind were, would it be expected that based on the feedback that was received and documented that it might guide, like, for instance, changes to land use and zoning, allocation of city resources to build parks or install public art, things like that? Is that kind of what the potential outcomes could be based on the neighborhood plan? Or maybe I can get some more clarification on that.
Yeah, so today we have two neighborhood plans. We have the Central Issaquah plan, and then we also have the Old Town plan. And both of these documents are, again, extensions of the comprehensive plan. So they outline the vision for that neighborhood and goals. So like the comprehensive plan, these policies help inform land use decisions. So, I'm trying to think of a good example. So, for instance, like in the Central Issaquah plan, there's a policy that says, development should be walkable. So, in the land use code, there are regulations that state, for blocks that are more than 300 feet, you have to have a path through block passage. So that's the intent, I believe, of these plans, is that, again, you're outlining the vision, what you think is important, what things that you would like to highlight, and then it would then ultimately trickle down into the land use code or any other regulations. But it's not a guarantee. It's not just saying because it's in the plan, we're automatically going to change the code for these things. But it's a plan, it's a vision. Does that answer your question?
It did, yeah. Thank you very much.
Okay, I got a fair voice, a couple things real quickly. I think one thing, Valerie, that would be good to keep in mind is, and I can't agree, I can't remember who made the comment, might have been Nina, but kind of having a liaison that works with the community. The last thing we want are a bunch of Hatfields and McCoys getting upset with one another because they have two different visions of what their neighborhood should look like. Because I also think those surveys, they've got to have a certain amount of anonymity. These people have to live with one another. And if they have strikingly different views, it's probably a good thing that there's, like I said, some of that shielding from surveys and things like that. So those are things I would keep in mind. I think, to Commissioner Krass's point and also Commissioner Milligan, it is an interesting question to ask who makes up a neighborhood. And I think when Commissioner Krass is probably talking, again, I do have a trouble with the worshiper that comes once a week. Do they get a say? But then I could see the institution itself. I know there's like Chabad, the Lubavitchers are up in, by Black Nugget Road. Our Savior Lutheran lives near me. So I would say the institution probably gets a say, but does an average worshiper that comes from out of town? I don't know. I would kind of agree. How much of a say would they really? And should their vote override someone who actually pays taxes and lives in that neighborhood? I'll take the bait. Experiencing homelessness, that one kind of shocked me. And I know we want to be inclusive, and I get that. And like I said, I think a lot of the document reads really, really well. Don't know if that one's there because, I mean, the whole idea of being homeless is they're not part of that neighborhood. And I could be wrong, and I'm happy to have my mind changed. That one kind of stood out. So maybe there's more clarification, because the way I see the experience homelessness, I think of families that have fallen on hard times, but then you also have the other picture of homelessness and that are more transient, I guess. So again, I think more clarification on who the stakeholders are rather than a broad, basically anyone that touches the earth in this neighborhood gets a say. Those would be a couple things that I would point out. But ultimately, I'm looking forward to it. And I think as far as what you mentioned about Old Town, that's a good example because, again, a lot of the business community does get a say. Definitely on Sunset, there's a lot of business activity. The homeowners themselves got a big say in that particular plan. Those houses obviously being historic, but part of the fabric of the community, so there's certain codes that are for them that are not applicable in other parts of the city. So I think the Old Town was a good, Central's more, I mean, it's more broad, but I know it has its own things, but Old Town's a good example, I guess, when kind of rolling this out to present to people, okay, here's our first neighborhood plan that is kind of coded in, and yeah, a couple suggestions. I do see.
Those are great.
Yeah, and I do see a little Simpson hand, so Commissioner Milligan.
Now I'm a member of the Simpsons. Thank you. Nina Milligan here. Thank you for carrying that conversation and helping to put words to the concern I had. Thank you, both of you. This inspires me to say something really bold that's not in our document, but it may provide a future solution. We do not yet have district city council representation. And when we go to look to who's accountable and how do they represent it, and what interaction do we have with the members of a neighborhood, when we, because we will at some point, have district representation for city council members, this will be a really interesting and maybe valuable in solving this quandary about who's in the neighborhood and who's accountable to them and how do we do it. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Milligan. Commissioner Kennedy.
I think my initial question is, assuming we've had meetings for neighborhood planning before, like Old Town, who does come to those meetings? Because we're talking a little bit about people within the neighborhood potentially disagreeing, and we're talking a little bit about people from outside outside living and working in the neighborhood, potentially having say in that neighborhood. I'm on board with the sort of limiting who has a say in permanent aspects to a given neighborhood. I can't fathom, someone from a totally different neighborhood, someone lives on Squaw Mountain is going to come over to the Highlands and say, well, this is what the Highlands should look like, but I don't live or spend much time here, but I'm going to have a voice, or vice versa. So the question being, are we imagining things that aren't super likely? Maybe. In the meetings we've had so far, has it been mostly people that live in that area?
Unfortunately, I haven't been involved with those plans, and the best person to answer that question is not here, which is Kristen. Stephen, do you have an idea? Or can you speak to that?
Yes. Stephen Bideau, Long Range Planning Manager. So a lot of, at least pretty much Kristen was the only person that's on the team that was in person for a lot of those discussions with the Old Town. But in my discussions with her and my familiarity with the plan, there was direct communication with members of the community that live directly in Old Town when they were having discussions about how they wanted to frame the vision and the policies and even the design characteristics that became regulations for Old Town. There were communication with the businesses that are in Old Town. There were communication with the homeowners and renters in Old Town that live in Old Town around how they wanted the neighborhood to look. And so to answer many of your questions, there were direct communication. There was likely communication from people outside of Old Town as well, but that's not an aspect that's really in our control of who can attend any of these public meetings. But we do take into account who are we directly inviting to a lot of the meetings. And so when we had meetings in Old Town, there was direct communication to a lot of the residents and the businesses that are in Old Town on when those meetings were occurring, when they were occurring. And so we, at least are fairly confident that we were getting at least majority say in terms of how that Old Town plan was being formed. Does that help answer many of your questions in terms of like how we do it? In terms of like when a survey goes out, we always ask the question on where you live in the city, and we take that into account when we're kind of doing the analytics on the responses that we get for those surveys. So that is also taken into account when we're doing any of our engagement.
I'm wondering if there's any language we want to put in there, not limiting who comes to the meeting. Everyone can come to the meeting, and I could see lots of people wanting to go to a meeting about Old Town. A lot of us spend time in Old Town. That's sort of our central core. But then to the extent, if there were a larger group that wanted to have significant say that could somehow outvote people that actually live in that area, that are most impacted by anything in that area, that staff is taking into account, sort of weighting the votes of the people that live there over, we get the voices of everyone, but weighting the votes of the people that actually live in a given area. I don't know that it's needed, but if it were.
I'll just jump in here real quick. Fair voice. I think if I think I understood Stephen, basically the surveys go out to people that live in the neighborhood. But then when you have your open houses, as to your point, right, they're open to everyone. But ideally everyone states their name, their location, what part of the city they live in. And to your point, yeah, a lot of people spend time in Old Town, the historic street right there. But it might be something like, yeah, the surveys only go out to people, registered with an address there. Go ahead.
I think it's also important that we're talking about this because when you start rolling this out, you're setting the foundation when you say play, pray, or wherever the different options are, of setting the expectations of who's a participant in this thing. And we should be very clear, and that'll then inform a plan before it even gets rolled out of how this thing works. Because you may, based on the words that you use, kind of avoid some of these things. And yes, people can come in and have an opinion, but
yeah,
but I think you set the wrong expectation if you have it too broad in the written document.
Yeah, but to Commissioner Kennedy's point, I mean, again, everybody wants to probably say something about old. Again, people on Squawk probably not as concerned about, maybe Providence Ridge. But yeah, I guess something to keep in mind, and we'll look forward to how staff rolls that out. But before we go, Commissioner Milligan also would like something.
Thank you. And thank you, Commissioner Kennedy. I just want to interact with you a little bit and give you two examples of times where I saw that this was a real concern. One was Central Issaquah plan when we first were working on it and developing the first draft plan. There were a lot of people who came to those meetings who had a commercial interest in the town but didn't live there. And they were they had an outsized voice to the timid neighborhood person who was just wanting to get involved in their community. Another circumstance was when I was living on Mercer Island and we were revising the residential design guidelines, something like that, residential building design guidelines. oh my gosh, Master Builders Association, every developer in the Seattle and Bellevue area, they were all there to influence what their community, what the Mercer Island community looked and felt like when it was intended to be for the neighbors, the people who live there, to shape the future of their neighborhoods. So this does happen, and I'm really glad for the input that the other commissioners have provided to narrow the focus of our attention in getting neighborhood feedback. So thank you very much.
Yeah, good point, Commissioner Milligan. I'll just add that I agree. Old Town, you know, they're much more mom and pop, brick and mortar stores. We definitely had people, because again, I was pretty new, I think, when that was rolling out, so I vaguely remember it. But again, you had business owners that had little shops on Front Street. They definitely were a part of it. You had a lot of residents. But I could see how the Central Issaquah plan, right, they come in with a lawyer, you know, polished with their, what they want to say. They use their entire 5 minutes versus resident that speaks 2 minutes and you have to tell them to talk into the microphone. Commissioner Zakharoff.
Thank you. Commissioner Milligan kind of brought me to this question. It's not a question, it's more like a hope that if we want to engage more of the residents, we need to communicate with them a little bit better. So maybe there should be a little bit more information to residents, because very often, and that's what I hear sometimes from residents, they don't know things that are happening. They learn about them in the very last moment when they have plans they can. So for businesses, yes, as a business owner, I know that that's my plan, that's my interest. I need to be at a certain meeting at a certain time. But for residents, we need a better communication.
Great. Thank you, Commissioner Zakharoff. So I'll ask Valerie, have you got the feedback that you wanted?
I got a lot of great feedback. Thank you, everyone. This is
Okay.
very helpful.
Okay, and before we let Valerie off the hook, does anyone have anything else they'd like to add? All right, well, thank you again, Valerie. Great presentation. Great job, commissioners. Great discussion. And we will move on. There we go. All right. So the other item for discussion this meeting includes a draft review of the comprehensive plan as part of the city's periodic update. Stephen Padua, our long-range planning manager, will be presenting tonight. So Stephen, when you are ready, please go ahead.
Thank you, Chair Voice, and thank you, commissioners, for having me to speak about the draft plan tonight. So as you saw from your packet, there's a lot to cover. For tonight's presentation, I'm primarily going to be going through a lot of the changes since you last saw all the elements. Just to highlight the biggest differences in terms of like what you saw from the goals and policies from the previous meetings. In exhibit, well, that's going to be another slide. The direction we need tonight is going to be on additional changes the commission would like to see. Is there additional information that would be helpful for the commission's review? And then do you agree with the new or amended policies that are being presented tonight? And there are two that we're proposing for tonight. So going over similar information we provided in previous meetings, the background for the Growth Management Act is what is requiring the comprehensive plan for cities and counties. There are several goals that need to be covered within the comprehensive plan that translate into all the different elements that you saw in the draft plan. The comprehensive plan describes the city's vision for the next 20 years. How it addresses housing, how we want to address land use and transportation, all the other elements that are provided in the draft plan. And it influences a lot of the decision making for the implementation of the functional plans, that being the plans that have more of the strategies and the actions identified for each of those different topic areas. And then that helps inform our performance metrics that we use to guide a lot of our actions in terms of seeing how well we're making progress on any of our goals and vision. The process that we'll go through for discussion tonight is going through the list of changes that were included in Exhibit A. And so a lot of the slides that will be following this are in line with what were provided in Exhibit A for the list of changes. We also had a list of meetings that were used to help with updating the elements. several that were with this commission as well as the other boards, commissions that help influence the other elements that are in the comprehensive plan, as well as when we met with city council committees and city council on the discussions on any changes for a lot of those elements. The major themes that we took on for updating the comprehensive plan were kind of three big areas. The first being that we were really trying to make several updates to catch up with many new state legislation. Many of them were related to housing, some was related to environment, and then us also looking at equity. So that being another theme with this update, we needed to evaluate a lot of our goals and policies on how we are actually addressing social equity throughout the community in all the different topic areas. And so that is what you've seen in a lot of the policies recently or previously, as well as what you'll see in a lot of the changes that are in the current draft plan. And then the last theme is really trying to look at all the different functional plans that have been developed since the last periodic updates in 2015, and making sure that there's closer coordination in the goals and policies that are particularly in the comprehensive plan, but also in the functional plans themselves. Do we have any conflicting policies or strategies within two different elements or functional plans? Are there competing ideas within different elements and goals and policies? And so those were also part of that. What staff was really trying to achieve with this update is making sure that we are having that coordination across the board. So again, all the recommended amendments that I'm about to go over are listed in Exhibit A, and so I'll be kind of going in the same order that it's listed in that. Before I get started, actually, are there any questions about the overall general draft plan? Okay. So getting started with land use and sustainability, the first change that we're proposing is related to transfer of development rights policy. There was a recommendation from the Snoqualmie tribe to recognize the actual intent of transfer of development rights is with environmental preservation. And so that was part of that recommendation or that edit that was incorporated into that policy, was making sure that that is the focus on that policy. The next two changes is related to, or with policies B5 and B8, related to fish and wildlife. Consistent with some of the other changes we made in the environment and climate stewardship element, we moved these policies from the land use and sustainability element over to that new element. And then for policy D2, we updated language to identify safe fish and wildlife passages and reducing hazards to birds, bats, and other wildlife. We actually had new staff review some of the policies, and this is one of their recommendations, to recognize new ideas that are being incorporated related to animal safe cities, and making sure that's identified within our design guidelines for buildings. Similar to the idea of having dark sky initiative, where we're trying to be safer with an environment. There's also these safe, animal safe cities concepts that we're also trying to incorporate into the conference. Before I move on to housing, and maybe Chair Voice, would this be a good stopping point? I'd just stop with each element before I move on to the next one.
Yeah, there we go. Each element. Good job, Steve.
Okay, so yeah, any questions for the land use and sustainability element?
Anyone? Commissioner Kraft was saying something about bats. Bats, I'm sorry.
Okay, seeing no questions, I will move on. So for the housing element, we are proposing one new policy which we'll discuss later. This new policy is meeting housing needs of households at or below 30% AMI, and that being the area median income. And that was a recommendation by the Affordable Housing Committee, that's the AHC acronym there. And that is the recommendation to comply with King County planning policies that is prioritizing this housing bracket. So we'll discuss that a little bit more later, but I just want to identify that on the list. The next policy change is related to policy C10, and that is the protection of housing stability for renters moderate to extremely low income. This is a recommendation from other regional staff on complying with the regional policies that were adopted in Vision 2050 on protecting renters. And so that is where the recommendation came from, and that was one of the changes we incorporated into the policies. That being it for the housing element, are there any questions?
Commissioner Milligan. I saw that hand go up. Commissioner Milligan.
I'm trying to let somebody else go first. You guys got to be faster. Just have to. Okay, I'll go first. Thank you, Stephen. I had kind of a hard time matching the memo section with the comp plan section later, so I'm going to just focus on the first part of the packet. I'm going to call it the memo section, and I want to ask you if on packet page, if it helps, 31 out of 287, policy policy C11, where it was the prioritize affordable housing on surplus land. The reason I'm bringing this up is that this was a really lively conversation with the commissioners, either the first or second round, and it seems like something got lost in there. I recall that if it were suitable as residential, or something that characterized that this particular surplus land would be best used as residential, because there were a couple of reasons for that. Was to, I think, to assure the quality of housing, and another is that surplus land owned by the city could have many uses. The city doesn't just provide housing, it's also part of our economic and recreational offerings, and so not all surplus land would be used. Now, this is in zoned for residential use, so maybe I'm stepping out of zone here by talking about commercial. Nix that from the minutes. Anyway, do any other commissioners have a question about that? And then the other one had to do with the new policy, where it says explore, introduce, and implement emerging best practices. It's not capitalized, but I tend to read it that way, to effectively meet the needs of extremely low incomes. I was concerned that things like best practices can be dictated from, a more autocratic, bureaucratic, or pedantic approach to how we provide for the section is for below 30% AMI. Anyway, best practices is what jumped out at me there. Wondering if anybody else saw that.
Thank you, Commissioner Milligan. I'd also like to jump in before Stephen moves on.
Okay, moving on to transportation. So we made, and you probably saw this with some of the other elements, we made some updates to the vision statements so that it's consistently portrayed across the board. We essentially simplified the vision statements. The intent of what we were trying to achieve for the vision statement is the same with what's in the mobility master plan, but for the comprehensive plan, we simplified it to just a longer paragraph rather than the breakdown of what it was before. This was just primarily for consistency on how all the vision statements were being portrayed in all the elements. So we just want to make sure that we are same for transportation. The next update is related to the park system plan and changing the name that was identified in this policy. And so this was a staff update to make sure that we were consistent with what was being updated for the park system plan as well as the parks element. For policy C2, we updated this policy specifically were investments on enhancing equitable outcomes. And this was actually a recommendation from regional staff to be consistent with the regional policies under Vision 2050. And then for policy C4, we included, or we updated this policy. Investing in bike and scooter library programs. This was actually a discussion piece from the Planning Policy Commission, and then we incorporated additional edits from the Mobility and Infrastructure Council Committee that followed the Planning Commission discussion on this item. And so that's what you see in the draft element is reflecting both the commission and the committee's edits for that policy. For policy C6, this is identifying the regional growth center transportation improvements within central Issaquah, and that was actually a recommendation from the regional staff at Puget Sound Regional Council in compliance with the Vision 2050 policies. For policy E2, increase electric bike use, the edits that we made to that were consistent with the recommendations that we got from the Mobility and Infrastructure Committee, and that followed, again, the commission discussion on this element. For policy F5, bus stops meet LOS standard. This actually came out of discussion with regional staff at PSRC on state requirements around level of service for transit. And so we added new transit level of service standards to comply with both the state requirement and then what the regional staff are looking for to comply with Vision 2050. And then the last policy is actually an update to an existing one. That's a typo on the policy number, but it's adopting a policy on coordinating affordable housing with station location with sound transit was the intent of the new policy. And that came from the recommendation from the Affordable Housing Committee staff. That's it for transportation. Any questions, comments?
Commissioner Kennedy.
So my question and email, we talked, and thank you for responding about the pedal-assisted bicycles. Thankfully, Stephen answered my question as I was like, are we going to have Lime bikes littered everywhere? Is this where this is going? But he said, no, that wasn't the intent. Yay. But it says increase use of electric pedal-assisted bicycles, etc. I guess the verbiage increase use, aren't we supporting the use of these items? We can't really technically increase the use. We can support the use. So am I just being nitpicky about language?
I think the intent is supporting the use of electric bicycles, and the response that I gave to Commissioner Kennedy is that the intent of the policy is to support the rising demand for electric bikes within most communities, and how that becomes, or what that looks like in implementation is changing regulations so that you require, like with bike parking facilities, that you put wall outlets so people can plug and charge their bicycles once they're parked in those facilities. And so that would be one of those supporting uses for electric bicycles. And so it's things like that that come out of this type of policy. And so that is the intent, not necessarily bike share or scooter share.
So in my nitpickiness, it would be support use, maybe, and or encourage, but not actually increase. We as a policy isn't going to actually technically increase the use. It's going to support it or encourage it.
This kind of goes back to previous commission discussions on having stronger verbiage on what we want to do. So support was actually removed in a lot of policies and different elements, not just from this commission's discussion, but from other boards and commissions discussions on just having stronger action verbs so that we are actually showing how we support. And that's previous discussion on this policy with the Transportation Advisory Board was primarily to increase bicycle use. And so that's kind of how that policy came, or at least that term came for this policy. But if this commission would like to consider a different term or verb to use here, staff is open for discussion on that.
Discussion. Commissioner Kennedy, you want to finish your thought?
Not worth getting that nitpicky.
All I would say,
Language is everything. Commissioner Krass.
all I would say, and I think you hit on it, is like just needing to be consistent of what the role of what the government can and should do. Make sure that the same language is utilized across everything, and not choose it for this one, but for the ones that if like the government doesn't build things, but you can encourage, you could support, or whatever. So I would just say be consistent. That's really the only thing. And I understand the ideals to be more action oriented, but sometimes that then gives the implication that the city does things that they don't.
Yeah, I'll just real quickly, I'll second Commissioner Krass. I'm two minds of it. I understand what the city's trying to do with more action verbs, but it could be misleading, and I would defer to staff on this. It's a comprehensive plan. Is it appropriate? Because again, it gives the idea that the city might be funding this e-bike. But when I hear you explain it, like I said, it makes a lot more sense. Yes, have outlets. Yes, allow people to park their bikes right next to the Schwinns from the 50s. But again, increase is a little bit misleading because again, it's more supportive, but I get I just don't know if other people reading it will. But maybe this document, like you said, it's supposed to be for the average layperson that's not involved with governments. How that gets picked up. Two minds. Commissioner Milligan.
Thank you. And Commissioner Kennedy, do not understate the importance of what you brought up. The policy is in two places there of what you're talking about, the increased electric bicycle use and Mr. Padua's response is that it is incorrectly written. If what we're trying to say is the city, who is responsible for infrastructure, roads, lanes, requirements for bike parking, these things are all part of the city's contribution to the mobility infrastructure. We do not increase the use of electric pedal assisted, and I don't know if we want to, but we want to support those who are using them. So if it said increase or support the development of infrastructure for electric pedal assisted bikes, that says what Stephen said the intent was. But I want to go back to, I think it's C4 on the previous slide. C4 does say pursue partnerships or investments with micromobility options such as scooter share and bike share. That is the Lime Bike Litter program. And I don't know why, we had talked about this in Mobility Master Plan. I don't know why we would explicitly say that we want to do that. I think what we want to do is increase access to micromobility options. But I would never say such as bike and scooter share, because there are, or even maybe e-library bike programs. I've learned from my research that some cities have found it more affordable to buy people bikes that they take care of and not leave on the side of the road, graffiti, targets, whatever they end up being, because I think that Commissioner Kennedy used the right word, Lime bikes do tend to create a problem of their own. So I want to look at both C4 and C6. No, I'm sorry, C4 and E2 together. And then I have another comment about another one, but this is just for this conversation right now.
Any follow up on the e-bike?
Actually, I'm glad that Commissioner Milligan brought up C4 because that was, I obviously read the wrong one. I was thinking about the wrong thing on the wrong section because that was my concern that I brought up was, you know, love the idea of them, but I work on UW campus and those things are littered everywhere. And they just get left everywhere and right in the middle of the sidewalk. They're convenient and annoying all at the same time. So a little concerned about that. And then just in me being nitpicky about language and I'm glad we sort of had the further discussion and there's a little bit of agreement on just being clear as to what the city does versus what the city encourages using just the right descriptive word. Is it, we have pursue, we have prioritize, we can have encourage. We don't technically increase, we encourage, and just being consistent in the type of language we're using as to what the city is actually doing.
Would the commission be more comfortable if we look at both those policies and kind of broaden it a little bit more and just call out micromobility rather than specifically, or at least for C4, micromobility options that increase non-motorized options for people to be getting around and investments in that, rather than calling out specifically scooter library or bike share, scooter share. And then for E2, we can change the action verb to support to broaden it. Because the implementation portion really gets more called out in the mobility master plan rather than the comprehensive plan. That's really what dictates what that means to the city. And so there's always further discussion on how we actually develop action for a lot of these policies. But we can broaden that within the comprehensive plan and still meet the same intent. Is that what the commission is asking for?
Is there a definite, like micromobility is something that if you ask anybody on the street, they go, what are you talking about? So I think it may need, yeah, I understand that the intent, but you need to put it in language that people would know what that means.
We can find an easier
Yeah,
term that's
okay.
more intuitive for people.
How's everybody feel about Stephen's suggestion? Everybody okay with that? So don't be specific about what micromobility is, micromobility, and then obviously you might wordsmith micromobility itself, and then instead of increase, find one of the wonderful words that Commissioner Kennedy had suggested. Everybody good? And I'm gonna let me count Commissioner Milligan in here, but how you speak.
Okay. Yes, I want to agree, but I also want to add something that I think I forgot to say is that we're talking about increasing the use of mobility options that we don't have the infrastructure to support. In Issaquah Highlands, we have these micro mobility appliances being used on sidewalks that are for pedestrians, and not just the micro mobility, but electric assisted. And these become hazards. So I would love to see the cities explore either writing into one of these policies or having an additional one that says that we will pursue infrastructure that provides for the use of these. You know, where are they going to use them? We're talking about increasing the use of these things, but we don't have a place for them to use them. So say Squawk Mountain, you want to increase the use of electric assist mobility types for Squawk Mountain because it's hilly. That's what the policy says. But where are you going to put it? There's one sidewalk on one side of the road, so it's the only pedestrian facility. And then the rest of the road would need to have some designation for these vehicles to pass through. So I think we're missing something about infrastructure there. That's all. But otherwise, I'm agreeing with the direction. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Milligan. Stephen, do you think you have enough from us in order to wordsmith all of our wishes?
Thomas is online taking notes right now, so we're going to work it out together.
Thomas, hopefully you have enough in order to wordsmith all of our wishes.
And then Commissioner Milligan, just as clarification, your last comments there were for policy E2, correct?
Yes, that was referring to E2, but it also is related to C4.
Okay.
Because if we're going to pursue partnerships and micromobility options such as micromobility, bikes, scooters, I'm also thinking of the one wheels. That's a micromobility option. Where are they going to go? So it's actually both of them. And then I have one more transportation thing. Chair Voice, may I just chime in my last transportation thing? I think we're going to run this out pretty quick here. It had to do with Sound Transit. Oh, it's the additional one. Stephen? Yeah, thank you, the XX. I felt when reading this that the addition of a housing policy in the transportation element seemed misplaced. We have housing policies for the urban growth center, which is intended to be the epicenter of mass transit, including light rail. And it didn't seem correct to put it, a mention here about housing policies. So just my observation. I don't know if anybody agrees with me.
For the commission's consideration, so we'll talk about this one and the other housing, the new housing policy at the end of this. just because I want to provide more detail on the recommendations from the Affordable Housing Committee. That's okay to wait on that discussion.
I think we're good with that. Any final questions on transportation? I just had a real quick one. What happened to the green necklace?
So
The city
with
dropping our name that we've been using that name for so long?
Chair Voice, that is a great question, and I'm hoping to wait till we get to the parks element on tonight's presentation to get to that point, just because I didn't want to repeat the discussion for the commission.
Fair enough.
Okay. All right, so for the next element, it's with the environment climate stewardship. This being, as a reminder, this is a brand new element. This is consistent with what the city is intending with the development of the climate action plan, as well as many of our other environmental policies and goals that the city has established. This development of this new element also gets us in compliance with House Bill 1181, which is requiring a separate element addressing climate change and greenhouse gas emissions. A lot of the goals and policies that were placed in this element were actually pre-existing in the land use element in the currently adopted comprehensive plan. And so a lot of what went into this element was the existing goals and policies and revisions with the Environmental Board as well as with the Planning Policy Commission leading up to this full draft plan. So starting off with the vision statement, similar to a lot of what you'll see with this element, we had a meeting with the Environmental Board in January and where they provided some detailed feedback on the draft element that we provided them at the time. And so they had some feedback on the vision statement, and so many of the elements or the portions of the vision statement were updated based on the board's feedback. Same with policies A5, D4, E2, and E7. A lot of the edits that went into those policy updates were based on the board's feedback from the January meeting. The update to policy C4 is consistent with the updates to the parks element and the development or the update of the parks system plan, and so I'll have that discussion when we get to the parks element. For policy, well, actually, let's go back so I can explain some of the board's feedback on some of these policies. That would help with context. So for policy A5, the board felt that we should emphasize more on what we have in the policy to identify chemical exposure from runoff and impervious surfaces. And so that's why that policy was updated to specifically call that out. Before it was kind of broader language in the policy, so we were a little more specific. For policy D4, this was actually a clarification update to focus on just the preservation of the forest ecosystems as part of that policy. And so it's one of the smaller updates that we incorporated from the board's feedback. The policy for E2, there was feedback from the board that we should emphasize more on the outreach and education around the decrease of greenhouse gas emissions as part of the city's efforts. And so that was incorporated with that policy. And then the update to policy E7 on greenhouse gas emissions reduction programs and policies, emphasizing that the importance of efforts by identifying the vulnerable communities that are impacted by greenhouse gas emissions. For policy E8, this one was advocating for statewide policies to address upstream and downstream greenhouse gas emissions. Again, this was a recommendation from the board to emphasize more on how we get more support from the state on a lot of these efforts, particularly for regional efforts and coordinating some of what we're doing with our climate action plan. For policy H3, it's focused on the reduction of emissions from goods and materials and making sure that we are able to tie that in and be more specific on how we're doing that within the policy. And then for policy H4, a very similar update on making sure that we're being specific on reducing carbon emissions from construction projects. And so there was just more detail added to those last two policies. For policy H5 is the reduction of waste generation. The emphasis on resources for that policy was what was called out by the board. And then for policy I1, leveraging all government services, so federal, state, and local, on serving the Issaquah community. And then the edit was primarily reducing the redundant. We called out business population essentially twice, so we just made that edit. Okay, any questions on this element?
Like the environmental board did their homework. Good job. Question? How good of a job they did.
Okay, moving on to Parks, Recreation, Trails, and Open Space. So for this element, we had a lot of very simple edits to make since you last saw the element, and that is consistent with the change from the Parks Strategic Plan, which is what the name of the plan was formerly called, to the now drafted Parks System Plan. And so those several policies are updated to recognize the title change. And then for Creeks to Peaks, that is actually the replacement branding for the green necklace. And so that is what that concept is. The biggest change between the green necklace to Creeks to Peaks is that green necklace was primarily focused on connectivity to parks within central Issaquah only. Creeks to Peaks is now expanding that connectivity concept to parks to the whole city. And so there's regional connectivity, neighborhood level connectivity, as well as cross neighborhood connectivity. That is kind of the focus of the concept now. And so that is part of the larger purpose of the concept. Hopefully that answers many of your questions on some of the other elements too, but I'm open to discuss anything in addition to that.
Is it question time?
Yes, that was it for this element.
Any questions for the parks, recreation, trails, and open space? Mine's pretty straightforward. Is there still a focus, though, on central? I mean, again, I think Creeks to Peaks is great. Is there still a primary focus, though, for the central Issaquah area, or now the city just wants to take this broadband all the way?
Yes to both those questions. So the idea of connectivity within central Issaquah remains the same. It's just now the idea is now expanded to citywide. And as you go outside of central Issaquah, that connectivity kind of changes. Mm-hmm. Similar to the mobility master plan, there's different prioritization in the type of facilities that are identified for different areas of the city. You know, in central Issaquah, you have protected bike lanes and wider sidewalks, or even shared use trails throughout, or paved shared use trails throughout central Issaquah. Outside of that, you'll maybe have sidewalk on one side, or bike lanes, or shared facilities for bicyclists, vehicles, as well as pedestrians. And so it's a different combination of connectivity, but the idea is the same of having that connectivity to different parks throughout the city.
Sounds great. Creeks to Peaks. Good branding. There's an attaboy. Okay. I don't see anything from Commissioner Milligan. Anybody questions, comments for Stephen?
Okay. As you saw in the packet, there was no changes to the arts and culture element, but we're happy to discuss any of the policies with you if you have any questions about any of them. Okay, moving on to the economic vitality element. So for this element, we had several small changes, some from staff, some from regional staff. And so that's most of what I'll be going over really quickly with you. And so for goal A, the diversity of entrepreneurs, that staff just simplified the language around it. For policy A1, this was a recommendation from regional staff at Puget Sound Regional Council, and that is identifying underserved communities as it relates to customer service. For policy A3, another recommendation from regional staff from Puget Sound Regional Council, and that is identifying the displacement risk as you are looking at economic trends and diversity of businesses. For policy A4, again, staff simplified the language with a word change around the tax and fee system policy. For policy A8, and that's highlighted in red because in your packet it showed up as a different policy number, so I'm correcting that with the presentation. But this policy was considering economic impacts, and This was another small edit by staff to make sure that it's clear. For policy B4, this one is supporting growth of industry clusters. So some of the discussions that we had with Commission as well as with the Services, Safety, Parks Council Committee was providing a little more detail on what that meant. And so that's the edit that we made for that policy. For policy B5, we again simplified the language related to the Sustainable Business Practices policy. For policy C4, we provided a little more clarity, again, from feedback from the Council Committee on placemaking opportunities. And so there's actually a little more detail in that policy. For policy C5, again, from Council Committee feedback, we added a little more detail on the promotion of arts, history, and culture as it relates to businesses in the community. And for policy D2, this change was highlighting historically underrepresented communities in the workforce and education as we are expanding a lot of the businesses in the community. This, again, came from regional staff at Puget Sound Regional Council. That's it for economic vitality. Any questions or comments?
Not seeing any.
Oh.
Oh. She's always waiting for somebody to go first. Commissioner Milligan.
I am. Thank you, Chair Voice. Okay, I had two questions going. You might have to go back a slide, but they were just guides on page, well, now I don't know what the pages are, 15. Policy A1 and A3. There's additional language, and I find that these have redundancy in them. A3 names the reduction of displacement risk already. And so to say it up in A1, which is about customer service, didn't seem redundant. And also A1 is saying that the city should provide high quality customer service and a regulatory process that's fair for all businesses. It could end there with a period. When it goes further into small, local, historically lack capital and underserved communities, I think that's going to be very hard to implement because those are not well defined, or maybe they're not well defined in the document, but I bring that up as a problematic section. And then D2, again, historically underrepresented communities, is that defined somewhere? And perhaps it should be, if we're going to say it. I'm not saying that we could. I think the other is that it says increase access. When we say increase access, it means to me that we're decreasing somewhere else if we have a limited or a finite set of resources. So if we're increasing access to career pathways for historically underrepresented communities, we're going to be decreasing them somewhere else. Perhaps what we mean is make additional investments in career pathways for historically underrepresented communities. Maybe that's what we really mean. I didn't think that we meant that we want to take from one group and give to another. And maybe it is, but that's what, if we just say increase access, I think that that's what that implies. And we could solve that by saying add additional investment for my ideas.
Thank you, Commissioner Milligan. Any comments? Now that she brings it up, A1 does kind of sound funny. You guys might want to wordsmith a little, because it says efficient and predictable for all businesses, and then literally the next word is especially. So that does sound a little funny when you're reading it. So I would maybe wordsmith that. Yeah, because it says that is fair, responsive, efficient, predictable for all businesses. And next word is especially, so it does sound a little funny. I think that's all I have to. Now we got some take.
Well, I was chuckling when Nina started because that was, in my email to Stephen, I brought up that exact issue, which I think your response made sense. I still think it's sort of a redundant language. So I'm chuckling at the fact it's getting brought up several times, but it could stop it for all businesses.
Yeah, Commissioner Patterson.
Just finding the common thread in the three that Commissioner Milligan brought up was they seem to be related to the Vision 2050 from PSRC. You maybe expand a little bit about how specifically those parts were added based on that document and that feedback.
No, thank you for the question. So because the policies A1 and A3, I'll start there. For A1, it calls out specifically customer service, and for policy A3, it's talking about more of the economic trends. You're correct. There is a little bit of redundancy, except for the fact that they're actually calling out different concepts for supporting businesses, that being customer service and the economic trends analysis in terms of how we're preparing for any changes. And so that was the point that the regional staff made of making sure, even though it's repeating the same language, it's actually calling out different services or different how we are serving the business community. And so that was why the recommendation was to have very similar language for both of those policies, and that's what's presented in the draft language. Does that help answer some of your questions? We can still take a look at the language in terms of trying to fix some of the language suggestions that many of the commissioners are suggesting tonight. But that is helping kind of providing context for some of the why the regional staff was making those recommendations.
Yeah, no, thanks, Stephen. And it does. I just go back to Connie's point earlier. Is like I said, it's, you know, you were thinking of the lay people that are reading this, and if it's that confusing for commissioners who do this for fun, like clearly maybe the public might have some questions too about the redundancy. So, okay. Well, thank you, Commissioner Milligan, Commissioner Kennedy, Commissioner Patterson. Any other comments before we move on? Okay.
Before I move on, there was comments on policy D2, and it's the same response in terms of why the regional staff were making the recommendation of having similar language for that policy. So again, it's calling out workforce education versus customer service and analyzing the economic trends. So three different concepts in, at least from the perspective of the regional staff.
What do you think of Nina's, Commissioner Milligan's comment on the increase, the word increase? I see Commissioner Milligan popped up again.
You know, thank you for bringing it up. And that's something that staff can take a look at.
Okay. I don't know if she's going to comment on that, but Commissioner Milligan.
Thank you. I'll just thank you very much, Stephen, and thank you, Commissioner Patterson, for asking the good question. I better appreciate the three different categories. I think my main concern is using terms that will be very hard to implement historically underrepresented communities. I think that we all have a kind of a feeling about what we're getting after here, but I don't know if it's really implementable as is in identifying that. And then the up earlier in the A1, the long list that goes in here at the very end, for instance, at the very end, that businesses especially, so high quality customer service for all businesses, but even more so for those that are small, local, historically lack capital, represent underserved communities. And then the word is and. Kennedy's going to jump on this one. And are at risk of displacement. You're saying that especially for those who are at risk of displacement, including this long list, I think we need to look at that and try to find something that's really tighter and more implementable, one that emphasizes all businesses, but that we have a focus on these types of businesses. So anyway, thank you.
As I like to do, instead of maybe especially for all businesses, with intentional focus on businesses that are. I think that's the intent of it. Might go over a little bit better with what we're trying to do.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, we'll take a look at that. Thank you. Okay, for the human services element, there were no changes to, but I'm happy to discuss any questions or comments for the policies that were presented. Okay, move it on to the bigger package, that being the utilities, public services, and capital facilities element. So previously, you actually saw these as two different elements, and that was what came out of the original comprehensive plan, that being the utilities and public services, and then separately, we had the capital facilities element. And the reason why we combined the two is because both elements actually called out level of services. And there was actually a lot of redundancy having that split between two different elements. So we combined the two. And there's also a lot of relationships between utilities, public services, and capital facilities in terms of what the needs are for each of those different topic areas. So similar to some of the other elements, we simplified the vision statement for the comprehensive plan, but we also had to adjust it because of the merger of the two elements. For policy A2, we specifically called out the capital improvement program and incorporated edits to comply with state requirements, and that came from regional staff recommendations and review of the element. And then for B8, calling out multimodal transportation level of service, this is actually now pointing people to the transportation element of mobility master plan for transportation level of service, rather than repeating it here and the transportation element. For policy B9, we called out the level of service for public schools. This is making sure that we are staying consistent with the school districts on their planning efforts and making sure there's compatibility on how we are planning for growth with the needs for schools. For policy D12, this one, we added a little more detail on the rate assistance programs policy, and this was a staff edit incorporated since your last review. Policy F8 is actually a new policy that was recommended by the Mobility Infrastructure Council Committee. They reviewed it after the commission reviewed this element, and they felt that we need to highlight a lot of the ongoing efforts that we already have in coordinating police and human services on keeping the community safe. Goal G8, this was updated to make sure that there was coordination, and this was a staff edit that was incorporated. And then the same goes for policy G9, the sustainability best practices. This was coordination with the environmental element and make sure that we're using consistent language between both elements while trying not to add in any of the redundancy that we worked so hard to take out. Okay, policy G11, again, this one was calling out level of service for public schools. I think I have that incorrect. 1 second. Yeah, what's on the presentation is incorrect. So this was a new policy that was introduced for consistency with the environment and climate stewardship element. So some of the language in there called for wanting us to make sure that it is identified and consistent within this element. And then for goal I, staff just put in a few edits to make sure that there's a little bit of clarity on what this goal was looking for. And then for goal, policy I6, this is, again, wrong on the presentation. This one is specifically calling out diversion of solid waste from landfills to recycle and compost as a priority, consistent with the language that's in the environment and climate stewardship element. And then policy I8, this one is a new policy, again, added for consistency with the new environment climate element. Then for policy I-9, well, just for policy I-9, I-10, and I-11, all three are new policies that were recommended for consistency with the updates to the environment and climate element. Policy I-11 is very similar to the previous ones where it's recommended for consistency with the environment and climate element. And the update to policy K-12 is with developing utilities, public services, and capital facilities priorities. This was included as a new policy to show coordination between, this was actually new with the merger of the elements, making sure that we're using consistent language. So that's part of the coordination for implementation. And then just really quickly, I want to quickly identify several policies that were removed. And a lot of that was for redundancy purposes. So are there any questions on the last element with the
You're
list of
doing good
changes?
to the last 2 minutes. You want to get any questions as far as utilities? I think most of it made sense. Yeah.
Okay.
I think, yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
All right, for next steps for the conference plan, we have the draft plan out for public review. We are planning for the Planning Policy Commission to have a public hearing at the second meeting in August. Then it'll go to Council Committee for review for a few months, and then Committee of the Whole, and then City Council tentative adoption in December. And so that's kind of the general timeline from this point. So the direction we need tonight, are there additional changes that the Commission would like to see to any of the elements, goals, and policies? Is there additional information that might help with your further review of the elements, since you have 2 more meetings to discuss the draft plan? And then do you agree with the new amendments, policies as presented, which I have those 2 specific ones on this slide, but Chair Voice, I leave it up to you if you want to cover the first 2 questions first and then go to the last.
Yeah, I kind of feel like it was an iterative process like we did it the entire time, but let's start with question 1. Commissioner Krass.
The game show. Just want to reiterate just the language of consistency and what the city really does and doesn't do, and reflect that across. I think that'll simplify it. And then to answer your question number 2, while I have the buzzer here, is I think it's super helpful just showing what's different from the last time and drilling in on that. So it is, when you get 300 pages, but when you can zero in on the table of what's different, that helps a lot.
Yeah, no, the matrix, very helpful. I think you captured a lot of our comments as we were moving through the presentation.
Okay.
But Commissioner Milligan.
So are we going to do number 3? Because I want to go back to A1 and the economic vitality and clarify something, if that's okay. So back in A1, where we are talking about the city should provide high quality customer service, just listening to the conversation and thinking about it a little more deeply with all of you, where it says for all businesses, and then we add this amendment, and it comes from Vision 2050, but it's not like it comes from Washington State Code and we have to adopt it, I don't think. And what I kept thinking later is, even though I support our small, local, historically lack capital, those who are at risk of displacement businesses, I think that they are the heart and soul of our town. You think of Old Town and other little pockets of businesses. I think that's what makes Issaquah special. However, the city should provide high quality customer service and a regulatory process that's fair to all businesses. And let's think about Costco. Let's think about Swedish. Let's think about the great employers that we have in our community. They aren't any of those other things that are getting the especially. And so, maybe they don't need it as much, but it just makes me think that why don't we provide high quality customer service to all businesses. And then I'd like to know what the Economic Vitality Commission thinks of it. That's my closing comment on A1 in the Economic Vitality. Thanks for the extra moment.
Thank you, Commissioner Milligan. No, point well taken. Plus, we love the Economic Vitality Commission. They're great partners. We haven't got to see them in a while. I saw Chair Richley the other day, and hopefully we'll get to see him soon. They're a great board to work with. Okay. Can't seem to. Any other comments? Again, feel free to go questions 1, 2, or 3. Pass that one back up, please. Yeah, were you going to expand a little bit on the housing section? I know you were mentioning it towards the end. You wanted to.
Yeah, so we can go to question 3 if there's nothing else for questions 1 and 2 originally for the commission on direction needed. So we can go to the policy, new recommendations, and new policy, if that's.
Yeah, I think.
Okay.
Go ahead, Mr. Kraft.
You know, when the language, as we talked about, is important. Before, the thing that got my attention when it said meet housing needs, which is something that we'll never be able to do. That's, you could say you could prioritize them like you do on this slide. So I'm curious what the true role is. So hopefully we'll get into what that means, because meet and prioritize are very different. Because we'll never meet housing needs for anybody, let alone people who are impossible. It's an impossible task.
Yeah, no, that's, Commissioner Kress, you have actually a great point. So the recommendation that came from the Affordable Housing Committee staff, that is what's represented in the draft language. What the intent is prioritizing 0 to 30% AMI housing needs. And so even though, we could change the terminology to exactly say that, we just still wanted to pose the question because we already have an existing policy that calls out 0 to 50% AMI as a high need for the community. And so that is how we originally presented the element to the regional staff, but they feel that to fully comply with the King County planning policies, specifically for housing, we need to have a policy specifically calling out 0 to 30% AMI. And so that's why we want to have the policy discussion with you all.
My question is not about the number, it's about the word. Because we'll never meet housing needs. It's impossible. You're never going to meet the housing need for low-income people in this city. You may be able to help some people, but you're never going to be able to meet that. So that's, whether it's 30 or 50, you could prioritize all those things. I'm totally cool with. But I have trouble when we have language that we know we just can't.
Well, we're happy to take a look at it and just change terminology to say prioritize just how it's presented on the screen, if that is what the commission supports.
Yeah, no, valid point.
Okay. Seeing some nodding heads, so staff can take a look at that and change the terminology. Is there any more discussion on the first one?
Sure. Yeah, I think when I was reading the proposed new policy and kind of comparing it to the existing policies, maybe it was the term best practices, like Commissioner Milligan brought up, that kind of like caught me on the new policy. But I also go back to kind of some of the things that have been done on this plan, which is like reduce complexities, simplify, remove redundancies, and I kept rereading all of these existing policies and trying to pick out, what's missing that a new policy had to be created. And personally, I couldn't really find, I felt like it was similar enough to like C4, where it clearly calls out, especially housing affordable to households at or below 30% AMI. There's another one that's at or below 50%, another one's at or below 80%. Obviously, that's inclusive of 30 and below. I think affordable housing is a need in general, and I think that it does call out 30% a few times in a few different ways here. So to me, adds redundancy, which I think is an exercise that the city staff did great in trying to remove throughout this document. However, I would yield to the idea that maybe like the Vision 2050 situation, there were specific words or instances in the new policy that aren't maybe covered in the existing policies that just weren't, I guess, obvious to me. So I'd be interested to hear both commission and staff feedback on that at some point.
Yeah, the primary reason for the recommendation from the affordable housing staff was specifically because we did not call out 0 to 30% AMI. That is the reason for this, and that is a King County planning policy calls out 0 to 30, and so that is the compliance that they're looking.
Did you get everything you need as far as this policy question?
I think
Or
so.
you're looking for more?
I just want to make sure, is the commission supportive of the new policy, I guess is
Oh,
the
okay.
more clear question I want to answer.
Commissioner Milligan.
Yeah, maybe I could chime in and saying that prioritizing 0 to 30, I am supporting what the other commissioners have already said. We have policy that shines a light on those in greater need. Maybe we just need to include 30% rather than calling it out as one element of all of our affordable housing spectrum, because we need affordable housing in the whole spectrum of AMI ranges. And to say that you prioritize 0 to 30 means that then you deprioritize 30 to 50, 50 to 80, 80 to 120. Anyway, maybe we just need to add that recognizing that 0 to 30 has needs that need to be called out. Thank you.
Able to follow?
Yeah, no,
Okay.
it's mainly just trying to get an idea from the commission if adding it, specifically calling out 0 to 30% AMI is consistent with some of the discussions we've had with the housing policies.
I'm trying to remember, I'm never going to remember it for the life of me. I'm trying to remember the percentage of housing that we needed. I know from 0 to 30 was the biggest percentage, and obviously 30 to 50 was the second. But how do you say that in a way that, to Commissioner Milligan's point, you're not trying to deprioritize? So I guess language cleanup on aisle 4 again.
Staff can take a look at this one and specifically call out the needs to show the kind of recognizing the importance of it.
Anything?
Moving on to the second one. And this one was an amendment to an existing policy in the transportation element. And that is specifically calling out for coordination with Sound Transit around connectivity as well as affordable housing around future light rail station. And so that is what they're also calling out is that connectivity and affordable housing piece in coordination with Sound Transit as what they're requesting with this amendment.
Commissioner Kraft?
Good question, because we're late. We get the trains in 20 more years, but Seattle's had them for a while. Bellevue's rolling out. Is there anything we could learn of how they handle that exact question? Because they've had to do this probably many years ago.
Sure. So Sound Transit actually has a specific policy requiring that with any transit-oriented development close to any of their high-capacity stations, that whether it being bus or for light rail, they require affordable housing around a lot of those stations and housing development and mixed-use development with, at least with the properties that they control. And then that's usually what they coordinate with the cities on their regulations policies of what they are being zoned around those stations, that being that they want it to be a walkable area around the stations, more so than parking lots where everybody's just driving to the station. So that is some of the coordination. A lot of cities do. They do it in different ways, but that is part of the discussion with Sound Transit when we are starting to plan for these light rail stations. Does that help answer your question on?
It sounds like you have a blueprint to be able to figure that out, as opposed to us trying to solve it ourselves. It sounds like.
So earlier this year, the City Council actually adopted a light rail planning document that staff had put together with a consultant, specifically outlining everything that Sound Transit's going to be doing once they start the process for planning for light rail in Issaquah. And so what we did with that planning document, and I'm going to give Thomas Valdez, who's on the line, credit for the development of that guide. What we did in that document is outline specifically what the city needs to do, prepare for those conversations throughout that entire process, and that being looking at station locations and what we want to do around those station locations, and likely having land use conversations with this commission as well as with City Council of what do we want to do around those stations. So while it's not a policy called out in the comprehensive plan, it's called out in very fine detail in that planning document as well as within the mobility master plan.
Let me ask you, Stephen, would it be, and again, I don't know, would it be helpful to put something like that? The comprehensive plan's obviously going to be updated before we get our train, to your point. Would it be helpful to say something to the effect of, look at regional sister cities that are already implementing the Sound Transit to quantify data, and would that be helpful, or do you think that's not necessary?
We actually did that in the development of the light rail planning guide. And
Okay.
so some of that effort has already started with that guide, and then we're going to continue a lot of that research as other cities and other parts of the region move forward with implementation with light rail in their areas and learn from a lot of their situations on how they got things in place.
Would it make sense to put that, though, as like a policy goal in the actual comprehensive plan? Because again, it's going to be updated before we get Sound Transit here.
We can.
Yeah, I don't know. Like I said, I'm kind of asking you more as staff, like, would that be helpful? Is that limiting?
No, because we would do it anyway, trying to learn from others on how they approach that coordination with Sound Transit and, if Sound Transit's process might change in several years, what did they learn from some of those changes and maybe adjusting some of what we're planning to do based on that. So we would learn from that, or we would try to learn from the other cities anyway. But if the commission thinks that it's helpful to incorporate that into the policy as guidance.
The reason I think it would be helpful is, again, I'm kind of thinking about the public comment earlier where, again, this is a document that everybody in the city should be able to read, not be involved with the city, be like, oh, okay, this is where they're collecting data from. It's not only this plan, but they're also looking at regional cities that are implementing their Sound Transit as we speak. I think Redmond's also up and running. Yeah, Bellevue, Seattle. Yeah, so I mean, again, there's already a few, and again, our station won't be ready for, a long time. So again, I think it would be helpful myself, but it'd be interesting to see what type of language you guys could put together. Because again, I like the idea of the public comment earlier. It'd be an easy read. Commissioner Milligan.
Thank you. This is a really good conversation. I appreciate coming back to the new policy that has the partner with Sound Transit in bringing light rail service to Issaquah. By adopting supportive land use policies, it previously went straight to by creating a safe multimodal connectivity to the new station, which seems like a very appropriate comment to have in the transportation element of the comp plan. To add the housing, I don't think belongs in the transportation element. Also, we already planned for the location of the light rail when we created the Central Issaquah plan, and moreover, the Urban Growth Center. The Urban Growth Center not only plans for mixed use and high density housing near the planned and hoped for light rail station, but it also has inclusionary housing. It addresses all of those issues, and it's in the land use planning element, not in the, wherever they want to put a train station, we're going to put in some affordable housing. No, we already know where we want to put the train station. We've already planned our city for it. We've already upzoned a good portion of our city to accommodate those needs. So I don't think that this addition is necessary, and I think it might, in fact, be somewhat harmful by dispersing these land uses to other places in the city where we did not plan to have them. So that's why I think that the new language should be reverted back to the existing policy. Thank you.
Any other further discussion? Steven?
Just for clarification, from Commissioner Milligan's comments, so the Central Issaquah Plan and city planning documents have not identified specifically, formally or officially, where a station will go for light rail. The Central Issaquah Plan is planning for high capacity transit and light rail, and the idea with Central Issaquah was upzoning as the regional growth center, but specifically where the station goes, that hasn't been finalized yet. And so that's actually part of the next steps, is identifying different alternatives that could be used for a station, and then coming up with a preferred alternative from the city's perspective. And that would feed into the environmental process that Sound Transit will take on when they're collecting feedback, analyzing the different alternatives. Part of the process that we learned from some of the other cities is that when we go through that planning effort prior to Sound Transit starting, that helps enforce a lot of the community support for that preferred alternative prior to the even starting their environmental review process. So that step has not been officially done yet, but Commissioner Milligan is correct in terms of Central Issaquah being that area where we want a station, but the specific station hasn't been located quite yet.
Thank you, Stephen. Any further discussion? Okay, well, you've got Nina's and my opposing points of view, so do with it what you will. It'd be nice to kind of see, maybe so you guys could workshop something and we can look at it next time we see this. Commissioner Milligan can completely change my mind, but I would think it'd be helpful.
Maybe I can get other commissioners' feedback on placement of a amended or new policy, that being, does it make sense in the transportation element for coordination, or in the housing element for coordination between transportation and housing?
So you have the following choices. You keep it in, option one, keep it in housing. Option two, you have it in transit. Option three, which is you keep it in housing, but you have a call out in transit because people would look for it in housing. And so I'm not sure how things are cross-related or whatever, but at least make a note to, there's a policy that ties these together, go look here is a way to do it. I'm not sure if there's a fourth option. I'm just saying those are the three, and you can figure out the.
Well, the fourth option, I think, particularly for the question for the commission tonight, is do we want to make the change to the policy? Because this is coming from the recommendation from regional staff on making sure that we're specifically calling it out in a policy, but some of the information that we provided in the staff report was we already identify a lot of that coordination within multiple different planning documents. Which is why we originally didn't have this policy recommended, at least initially. Staff can go either way, and just so you know, we can go either way with the different alternatives, but I just want to make sure that the commission has all the information that was presented for why this was recommended and why it wasn't originally in the policies in the first place.
Commissioner Patterson.
Yeah, I guess I'm leaning into Commissioner Milligan's recommendations a little bit in potentially, I guess, maybe splitting this proposed policy or keeping the original one as it was for transportation, and looking at a different way to approach the housing portion of this. With, like, for instance, are we actually partnering with Sound Transit to create affordable, higher density housing? No, we're partnering with them to bring the light rail, and that would influence land use policy, that then we would do the mixed use, high density housing. So I think that in itself probably removes the housing part of it to keep it transportation oriented, in my opinion.
That's what we're after. Commissioner Milligan.
Thank you, Commissioner Patterson. You're helping me clarify where I'm trying to say. And if you break up that sentence and say that we are going to partner with Sound Transit to create affordable, high-density housing and mixed use near a new station, that would be saying that we're going to even allow Sound Transit to influence how we plan our land use. We have spent countless resources and really great planning to lay out a city that we think will work really well with our geography, with our population, with our neighborhoods, with transportation. And to defer that work to a transportation agency called Sound Transit does not seem appropriate to me. That seems like that's our job. And we do have land use that supports mass transit, including light rail, that serves the needs of affordability and mixed use. And what's the other one? High density in central Issaquah, especially in the urban growth center. The work has been done. We don't need to partner with Sound Transit to tell us how to plan our land use. I just still think that, but thank you, Commissioner Patterson. Please split it apart so that we can see it for what it is.
It goes back to kind of the role of what the city does. And I think this highlights the fact that what we'll do is we'll partner with them for as early as possible line of sight of where it goes, so then we can do the right things from a housing standpoint within our city. And that's really what the partnership's about, is finding, just having enough time so we could build the right things around what we agree to as the place, as opposed to, so I think that may add some clarity based on what the last two sets of feedback have been.
Thank you. Yeah, and if it helps, I think somehow more from what I was just suggesting is making it part of looking at research. I just thought that would be helpful. I wasn't actually saying, I think what I'm hearing. So yeah, please don't let anybody think that I want sound transit to be dictating our policy. That's not what I meant. What I meant is just, is there a room for another element that just states that, hey, we're looking at you know, getting data from these other cities who have gone before. That's all I was saying. So anyway, fun tangent. Anything else for Stephen?
No,
Stephen, do you need anything else?
I think I think I have everything I need, unless there's additional comments.
No, I think I got mine on the record. Once. Almost.
All right.
That almost looked like a hand.
That concludes my presentation.
All right. Well, thank you, Stephen. Okay. The next item on the agenda is reports. So Stephen, or Amanda, or Valerie, or Thomas, anybody, anyone like to share reports with us?
Yes. So I just want to do a quick council update for the commission. So earlier this week, City Council adopted the annual code amendments, that being the long list of code amendments that the commission had previously reviewed. The recommendations that came out of the council committee, the Planning Development Environment Council Committee, going to City Council, there were two changes. The first one being that related to the heat pumps amendment, the council committee actually changed the requirements around screening for any installation in the frontage of a home, that being that they felt like that was increasing the burden on homeowners and cost for homeowners for getting the installations. They felt like that wasn't the city's place to put that burden on with any of those installations, but that it's still a consideration for housing associations to require some type of screening if that's something that they want to do. And so that was the one change, but that amendment on allowing heat pumps to be installed in side and front setbacks did still move forward as an amendment. The other change was the change for the pre-application meetings. Originally, the commission recommended taking that off the amendment list. When the council committee reviewed that amendment, their recommendation was to add it back to the list because they were looking at it as the financial risk to the city related to the exemptions. From that discussion on the pre-application meetings, the reason why we're proposing the amendment in the first place was to comply with State Bill 5290, which had exemptions in the provisions from basically the city committing to 20% refunds if we didn't meet our development review timelines. And the concern that the committee had was, yes, the city will still continue having conversations on looking at those provisions, but the deadline for when 5290 goes in place is January 2025. And so they felt like we needed to take action now to reduce that financial risk to the city and allow us to still have those conversations looking at the provisions. So that was the recommendation that the committee pushed forward for City Council, and they adopted those amendments on Monday. So I'm happy to have further discussion about that if the commission would like to, but I just want to make sure I wanted to highlight for the council update.
Yeah, no, thank you, Stephen. Obviously, the city council is looking at budgets and things that don't necessarily involve our purview. All right. If that takes care of updates, any other business or announcements?
Just one quick introduction. So we have Madeline Nelson joining us on WebEx tonight. She is our new planning intern, so you're going to see that name a little more often as she gets involved with commission meetings and preparations of the materials, attends with the chairs, meetings, but also potentially bringing topics to the commission for discussion.
Great. All right. Well, we know you're there virtually, Madeline. Hello. Okay. Is there anything from the commission? Any final word from staff?
Just that I really appreciate the discussions tonight on the draft plan and looking forward to continued discussion on August 8th.
Great. Thank you, Stephen. All right. There being no further business, we will adjourn at 8:33. Thank you, everyone.